might like to do, given the pounding that they've been taking from Israel, given that their terrorist proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, have been badly beaten. Their key ally, the Assad regime in Syria, has fallen. This is not the Iran it was on October the 6th, 2023. That's for sure.
Well, as we consider what capabilities Iran may have to retaliate militarily, what if it just is in the form of
Faen ass, hele PC-en alt bare låste seg her. Jeg holdt på å klikke. Ja, men jeg hadde jo 8000 pluss på den ene kontoen, så jeg fikk bare ut 3,5, for jeg fikk jo ikke, ingenting funket her. Kamera slo seg, alt bare låser seg. Jeg er så fitte lei det opplegget, ass.
Hvor langt har du begynt på?
Jeg holdt på med dritten her nå i faen meg over 25 minutter. Nå tappte jeg 8000. For kameraet begynte bare å blinke. Fikk ikke lukka på ingenting. Det bare var sånn der dritt. Nå er jeg der da. Men det er bare kaos. Du ser jo ikke shit her.
Det er for at du ikke har lys på.
Jo, men den viste bare batteri. Den bare blinka. Jeg fikk ikke logga på den igjen. Og så stod det OBS kjører allerede, OBS kjører allerede.
Ja, det er for at du sikkert hadde opp 2 ganger, sikkert.
Ja, det lyser jo ikke engang. Ikke noe funker her. Faen, ass. Hvorfor funker ikke den der, da?
Kabelen er trukket ut.
Kabelen er trukket ut? Jeg har ikke trukket ut noen ting, jeg.
Kabelen henger ned der.
Her?
Ja.
Well, there are a number of ways they could try and do it, and that's why we put substantially greater naval assets in the region, more on the way.
Jeg blir helt gæren, jeg.
Maybe more bluster than anything else.
Okay.
It can raise the level of danger, but we're fully aware that this has been a possibility.
Closed.
And if they try it, it won't simply be clearing mines away from the Strait of
Vänta.
Hormuz.
Okay.
I expect we would put much of the Iranian
60,
Navy on the bottom of the
66.
and we would be striking
Gul.
other targets inside Iran. This is a no
Der.
proposition for them.
Opp,
if they
der.
make mistakes.
Vi tester. Sånn. Sånn. Nå er vi i gang. Ok, så tar vi den ut. 30, 80, 66. Du må gå ned og slette flere den kontoen her. Jeg elsker å jobbe med... Jeg er så kunne det jeg kan, det er vi enige. Og så skal andre kunne andre ting. Men i mitt liv er det ikke sånn. Jeg må faen meg kunne alt. Og jeg skjønner jo ikke en dritt. Jeg skal ut derfra. 32. Der er den. Ok? Der er den sånn. Jeg trenger jo ikke 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kontoer. Jeg blir helt gærne. Ha på pause. Jævla idiot. Ok. Nei, jeg blir bare sur, jeg. Hva skal du med IT når ikke du kan bruke dem? Bra. Ok, nå er jeg klar. 80. Er det riktig da? Nei, den var feil. 66 er riktig. 32, er den riktig da? Den er riktig. 32 er riktig. Faen for en jævla oppkatter, ass. 66 da? Er den riktig? Ok, greit.
Det er jo ikke mer for meg.
Nei, det går fint med deg nå. Det er jo bra. Tusen hjertelig. Skal bare se på prosenten er 4000. Da går den. Kongemortis, takk skal du ha. Så godt da.
And we were all very informed 60 days ago and a few days ago that this was likely to happen.
The entirety of the Gang of Eight was not read in before this.
Again, the traditions of whether or not you do something, whether that's a peril, I have to be honest. I've always had a concern that in something where so many of our brave men and women...
Gult skal gå videre oppover. Vi må bare se nå, for nå støtter jeg her nå på 77.
deception about exactly where and when, and I think the president did the right thing. And for those members who didn't say a word when President Clinton and President Biden, Democrat after Democrat, launched against Libya, against Syria, you know, the list is,
A matter of notification is something real, though, right? When Jim Hines says the ranking member of the Intel Committee, he found out about it on social media. I
well, I'm glad
realize,
he's on social media.
well, I guess he is. He found out about it when President Trump posted it like the rest of us. Is this the new normal for the sake of secrecy?
Look, I think it is a little bit of the new normal. When we got Osama bin Laden, we found out about it. You were probably in the audience when the president, you know, was up there and they were taking him out. Look, there are things that are done with a recognition that they're likely to happen, but not the exact time and place and manner. But every part of this mission, a very successful mission the president did, to once and for all make it clear we're not going to tolerate a nuclear Iran. And let's be honest, this is not about the 2 weeks that Bibi Netanyahu talks about all the time. When they passed 20% and went to 60% enrichment, they enriched uranium to a level that is useful for nothing but nuclear weapons. At that point, they were so far out of compliance.
Ja, nå har ikke strøm mellom på den fittetelefonen.
And again, the president has made it clear he's holding out an olive branch every day, including today. But he's also made it clear he will not tolerate the continued behavior that has cost so many Americans
Har du rammet
all
på
the way
den
back to the
gullfoten?
early 1980s when the Iranian regime was young.
Jeg hører ingenting, jeg.
killing America.
I would know Congressman.
Har du 500 på den gullkontoen?
Ja,
Massey.
så jeg bare skal trede opp supersmå posisjoner, så vi bygger opp kontoen sånn sakte, men sikkert, sånn at jeg ikke trenger å tenke.
Riktig.
Bare sånn supersmå, så trede bare opp.
I served with Ron Paul, the original Dr. No. I served on judicial.
Vent, jeg må hente lader, jeg har ikke strøm. Det er fullstendig kaos rundt meg.
But just so you understand, the same Thomas Massey who absolutely says we have to do this in the Constitution would say that books, if they include statements about the law, can't be copyrighted. You can have a purist opinion, but history says that all the way back through Truman, before the War Powers Act, and since, president after president, to keep America safe, have acted without specific notice to Congress until after the fact.
If we, in fact, had a protracted conflict with Iran, though, I presume would sign off on a war powers.
Absolutely. If we're going to put ground troops there, which I do not advise, look, Iraq is in a war with Iran for 8 years. There's 91 million people in Iran, most of whom are innocent victims of their own unelected regime. So when it's all said and done, we need to do for the Iranians what we can do, which is diminish the ability of that nation to export terrorism, encourage them to spend that vast oil money on their own people, and empower them to make regime change if they choose to, not us. If there's going to be regime change, President Trump has made it clear, if there's going to be regime change, it's going to be not at the hands of the United States, but the hands of Iranians who have had enough of their now weakened regime that has been in power for 47 years. That's the reality. And it's not going to be Iranians living outside Iran. It's not going to be Americans. It's going to be Iranian people who have risen up again and again, only to be stabbed in the streets, imprisoned.
Helvetes opplegg!
Let there be no doubt, this is a regime that has captured and killed their own people for 46, 47 years. This is a regime that has led to deaths of Americans and others around the globe. And I happen to be of Lebanese ancestry, and I can tell you, I have been going to that region for 30 plus years. They have created a situation in which one of the most beautiful places.
Sorry, jeg blir bare helt gæren når ting ikke funker. Sånn. Nå skal egentlig gull gå mye mer. Bonsen begynner å stige nå. Det funker ikke mus her da. Det rett og slett knuser alt her. Gull stiger, bonds stiger.
They have been the nemesis of president after president, and they have led to a cost of freedom and progress, not just what's happened, I mean, you're never happy that it was necessary. President Trump did everything he could to avoid it. Let's face it, he went through his first 4 years trying to avoid it. And he went into this administration trying to avoid it. But the difference now is Iran has to make a decision. They're no longer in the nuclear business. Are they going to try to go back to the rocket and missile business? Are they going to try to close down the straits? I got to tell you, when they did it in 1987, Reagan responded by sinking their fleet. And I have no doubt that this president who wants peace is not going to tolerate the international order being disrupted by it.
And Congressman, how much will China and Russia, whether they decide to make a holding handshake, continue how things move?
China and Russia have been opportunist in this, but I don't think they want to go directly against the United States. It's not in their interest. The fact is, China and Russia, particularly China needs the rest of the Gulf.
Så går vi på Copper-kontoen. Yes, det er litt rotet her nå, for jeg har 8 kontoer jeg skal jonglere med. For han som har hjulpet meg med å sette opp kontoen, han har ikke slettet de gamle kontoene.
Would they like to continue? Yes. And by the way, if there's a change in the regime, I'm sure they'll still be selling to the Chinese. They're good customers. But the weapons that have come out of Iran, much of it with Chinese help, that have been in Russia killing Ukrainians, that's going to stop because of this diminishment, and that's a good thing for the rest of the world.
It's great to have you with us in person.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Congressman Darrell Issa, a Republican from California, with his view this evening, live from the nation's capital. Top U.S. officials have maintained the strikes were not meant to force a regime change in Iran, as we've been discussing. That includes Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who said this earlier today.
Så, nå tok vi masse gevinst på Copper-kontoen.
The president authorized a precision operation to neutralize the threats to our national interests posed by the Iranian nuclear program and the collective self-defense of our troops and our ally Israel.
President Trump seeming to contradict that message in a social media post this afternoon, writing, quote, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change."
Kommer til å gå videre. Kommer til å øke posisjonen min på gull og utover natta.
Why wouldn't there be a regime change? 3 question marks. For more on what's next for the political outlook in Iran, we turn now to Jen Gavito, Senior Advisor at the Cohen Group, former Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs under President Biden. It's great to have you back with us here now that we have seen the strikes take place. Your thoughts as we casually discuss regime change and a potential Iranian population that's standing by to rise up. Is this naive?
I think it's tremendously naive, and I should say first, it's great to be back with you. I do think that this is tremendously naive.
Han kan komme litt ned til 3375. Tar ut noe, kjøper den inn igjen. Da er vi ut av den, og ut av den.
That this is a brutal regime. Certainly true that it suffers from the lack of credibility among its people. That being said, there don't appear viable alternatives available to foment the type of uprising that would be needed. And I do think it's very important to remember that this is a sophisticated form of government.
Nå får jeg se chatten. Jeg har ikke sett chatten før nå, jeg. Blir du sittende uten natta nå, eller halve forresten? Nei, jeg skal trade. Nå er jeg ute av alt gull, og jeg kommer til å trade hele natt. Skal bygge penger til oss.
Well, that's an excellent point. I guess we all have questions about that. I wonder though, Jen, if you think regime change is naive, is it also naive to think there's a chance of Iran returning to diplomacy to the negotiating table? What incentive do they have to do so at this point?
Yes, certainly I hope that they will find their way back to the negotiating table. I am not sure how that happens in the immediate term. I think if you look historically at how Iran has responded to strikes, certainly not by the U.S. in recent memory, but against their interests, and history will tell us that they are going to respond. I think that goes without saying. And so whatever warnings we've heard out of the administration, to the contrary, I think just, again, is not necessarily realistic. I think what will be telling, though, in their response is whether, it looks like they are attempting to de-escalate the situation, or whether they continue to escalate. My prediction would be that they will feel like they have to strike strike back in a serious way. Their nuclear program,
Ok, nå er vi ute av gull. Kjøper gull tilbake nå om ikke alt for lenge.
So this has been a significant hit against their interests, and I think that you are likely to see a pretty considerable response. And so again, then, what comes next? Does the U.S. administration then seek themselves to de-escalate and try to provide the incentives that you referred to get them back to the negotiating table? Or does the situation, the escalatory cycle, continue in a way that it's difficult for either side to back down? And I think there's real danger there.
Well, so is this a traditional military response in your view, Jen, attacking our air bases, for instance, in Baghdad or Bahrain? The Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. We've got bases in Syria and Kuwait to worry about. Or is it a cyber attack, or God forbid a terrorist...
Nasdaq er ned 130 poeng, hva er det for noe? Skal han ned mye mer?
I think it could plausibly be all of the above.
Hva teit er det her da? Atomkrig så går Nasdaq så vidt ned, mens gull ikke går videre oppover. Dummeste sett. Vi solgte i hvert fall gull nesten på topp her da.
Iran in the past has really exercised some strategic patience in retaliation. And so while we are almost certainly going to see some sort of response in the days ahead, I'm not sure that we're going to see the total response. And so, you could look, I think, certainly months out and predict that there will continue to be implications even if, things stop here as far as U.S. strikes go.
All right, Jen, we appreciate it. Jen DeVito, Senior Advisor at the Cohen Group and former Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs during President Biden. Thank you. Coming up, oil futures up 3% as the market weighs the risks of Iran disrupting energy flows in retaliation for this attack. We'll discuss with Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy Group next on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
Det som er nå at gull kan droppe litt, for det er ikke noe support der, det er bare jump opp. Hvor mye er vi opp nå?
It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's
Sitter på
happening
370,
in
den kan falle
ETFs
til
like
370.
no one else. ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg.
Ja, gull er et kjøp nå. Men jeg er redd han kan falle litt.
It's the countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Making money isn't about drowning in emotions. It's about
Nå
understanding.
var vi faen meg heldige, ass, som fikk solgt oss ut helt der oppe.
Best way to glean signal from noise, and that is what we try to do every morning.
Ute av alle posisjoner på gull. Ute på den kontoen. Ja, helt ute der. 66 kontoen. Skal kjøpe der.
I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
I know that battle damage is of great interest. Final battle damage will take some time, but initial battle damage assessments indicate that all three sites sustained extremely severe damage and destruction.
That was President Trump last night announcing the U.S. military attack on Iran, and General Dan Kane, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this morning providing an early assessment of the damage. And back with us now on this special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Live from the North Lawn of the White House is Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. So Tyler, obviously there is still much we don't know about the extent of the damage that the U.S. was able to inflict on Iran's nuclear capabilities. But what else have we learned throughout the course of today?
Yeah, hey Kelly. Well, a U.S. official tells us that President Trump has spent today working here at the White House, but that doesn't mean that we haven't heard from the president. In fact, he did comment on what he thinks has been the extent of the damage, calling it monumental in one of his flurry of posts on Truth Social. He also confirmed for us that those B-2 pilots are now back at their home base in Missouri. And then in a third post, we talked about this at the top of the program, but it is worth reiterating. He did mention the words regime change in a post, although it is unclear under what sort of circumstances the U.S. would really get behind that idea. So those are sort of the threads that we're watching at this hour, but of course it comes against this important backdrop of how is Iran going to end up retaliating here, and that is something that the White House has said that they are prepared for and they are watching closely, particularly when it comes to U.S. personnel in the region. Now we should say that
Ja, jeg kjøper på 70 så kommer den dit.
say that there are sort of three ways that this could go. One would be a calibrated response by Iran that could even look as if Tehran lets the U.S. know what sort of targets they're going after. The second would be a calibrated response, but no sort of ceasefire. We know that President Trump has previously said that he wouldn't be in favor of a ceasefire, but instead just wants to see what he has called unconditional surrender. But then that third option would be that Iran actually hits back hard. And Joe and Kaylee, there are three ways that we are closely watching that this could happen. It could be going after energy infrastructure in the region. It could be going after those U.S. assets that we have been discussing. But the third would be closing or any sort of impairment of shipment through the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, that would be a pretty big development here for what it could mean for global oil shipment to those exports and those supplies going forward.
And something John Bolton indicated earlier this hour would not be terribly successful for Iran if it tried to do it. Tyler, we were just showing while you were talking video of Donald Trump late last night with the defense secretary, the secretary of state behind him in the cross hall of the White House making this announcement. We've not heard from or seen him today. Does he have any public events on the schedule this evening or early tomorrow?
No, as of now, we have not seen him publicly. We're going to have to wait to see what sort of agenda items do get on the president's schedule. We're waiting for a confirmation that he is going to end up at the NATO summit later this week. Of course, that would be very significant, as we know that our European allies have been lobbying this White House so that they can play a role in trying to get Iran to the negotiating table here and come forward when it comes to some sort of deal, even though, as you all know, Joe, last week President Trump said that Iran didn't want to talk to Europe, apparently to deepen the divide that we're starting to see come about, though we should say that earlier today President Trump did have a phone call with his UK counterpart, Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
Sunday duty at the White House for Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. We thank you, Tyler, for all of your work today. Joining us now with a look at market reaction to the attack, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick at World Headquarters in New York. Futures are open, Romaine. If you had asked anybody before this evening how Wall Street would react after the U.S. decided to directly attack Iran, I'm guessing the thought would be more severe than this.
I think that was the thought coming in, but remember, we had a taste of this when Israel first struck Iran back late June 12th here in the United States. And I think the playbook that is going to play out tonight and into Monday could potentially be a repeat of that. A big knee-jerk reaction where risk assets get sold off, haven assets get bought, but then a quick rethink here. And that rethink, Joe, is all around this idea of whether this is a regional conflict that will remain regional or something that could broaden out to hit U.S. assets or even something beyond the Middle East. If that were the case, you would probably see more of a severe reaction. We should point out oil prices did move higher by about 4%. They pared back some of those gains, but are still up almost 3% here. Brent crude, remember, hasn't actually traded above $80 a barrel since early this year in early January. It did do that early in this session, and that is going to be a key number to watch. And of course, what will dictate whether it sticks at 80 or goes beyond that is really going to be determined by what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. But real quickly, I do want to just draw your attention back to equities for a second, Joe, because there is a contrarian bet out there right now. And the contrarian bet is that right now, if you are able to get confirmation from a credible source that the nuclear threat of Iran was indeed obliterated or at least significantly hampered, that would actually remove one of the biggest risks to Middle East stability in years. And that potentially could be a net positive for stocks. And the case in point is I would just point you to the benchmark index in Israel, the Tel Aviv 35. That closed today on a 6-day run at a record high.
An excellent point, Romain. And as we consider other asset classes as well, I wonder what we expect to see in U.S. Treasuries, knowing they are seen as...
Vi mer ned,
if there's a concern that potentially higher...
Vi mer ned.
...to higher inflation risk, that could send bonds...
På futurene, på at Powell ikke setter ned renta enn en atomkrig med Iran. Det er det sjukeste jeg har sett i mitt liv, faktisk. Greit at gull er opp nå. Det skulle faen meg opp over $100. Ikke mindre enn når det ikke er krig, liksom. Det kan hende at det vil stikke etterpå, men det er bare... Og se på Nasdaq, da. Det er så vidt rødt. Nasdaq er mer ned hvis Trump sier noe gærent, eller hvis Elon Musk sier noe gærent, da er Nasdaq mer ned. Vi må ha gull over 75 her.
Ja, Nasdaq, den klatrer jo som faen, ikke?
Ja, jeg sitter og ser det.
Does the market hold its breath until we find out what the actual damage assessment is in Iran?
Well, I spoke to several analysts this afternoon, and two things that they said they're really...
Jeg tror vi får århundres crash på markedet.
Response, if at all, and more importantly, how severe can that response be? But the other thing too was to really keep an eye on this idea of trade.
For nå er det sånn der kokle munke. Nå liksom alle kjøper på dipp. Til og med i krig. Det gir null mening. Når oljeprisen stikker av, så er det masse selskaper som vil slite. Marginer vil bli skviset til helvete. Selskaper vil tape penger. Så er det enkelte oil servicer og oljeselskaper som tjener masse penger. Det er masse flyselskaper vil slite nå. Masse industri vil slite nå. Masse. For høy oljepris i USA er liksom ikke bra, da. Norge er bra.
That's something we heard about from the Secretary of State Marco Rubio during an interview on CBS's Face the Nation earlier today. Take a listen.
The first people that should be angry about it are the Chinese government, because they take a lot of their oil comes through there. So they should be the first ones that are saying if they mine the Straits of Hormuz, the Chinese are going to pay a huge price. And every other country in the world is going to pay a huge price. We will too. It'll have some impact on us. It'll have a lot more impact on the rest of the world. A lot more impact on the rest of the world. It would be a suicidal move on their part.
Joining us now for more is Bob McNally, founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. He was also a White House energy advisor to President George W. Bush. Bob, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I don't know what you think the probability is of Iran actually doing what they've threatened to many times before and never have done, choking off the stream entirely. But do they have disruptive secondary options available to them when you think about all of the energy infrastructure in this region?
It's great. Yeah, no, thank you. It's great to be with you. I think Iran will be very cautious and careful about attempting to fully disrupt the 18 to 20 million barrels a day of oil, 20% traded LNG.
Hva er det som kjører Nasdaq opp nå? Hva er det de tror for noe? Tror de at AI skal liksom redde et eller annet, eller? Hva er det de tror for noe? Nasdaq går mer opp enn gull? Hva faen, liksom?
Most important energy infrastructure in the world, the Saudi stabilization plan at ADCAIC. And that Sunday, we had the biggest open ever in Asia. We hardly see that right now. So they could also have proxies harass or attack ships here and there without a full-blown attempt to disrupt all of Hormuz traffic. So they have options to flash, if not play, the oil card.
Really interesting, Bob. You were with us a week ago tomorrow, setting the table for what was about to happen here. You talked about these possibilities, and we've seen oil behave pretty well since then. Is this market whistling past the graveyard, or is it in fact pricing in the risk that we're facing in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, Joe, no, I think we see an oil market that, as we discussed, is pretty inured to geopolitical disruptions in oil markets. Over the last few years, we've had several false alarms. The Russian invasion of Ukraine being one, and Israel and Iran's exchanges last year being another. Then oil prices spiked, but there was no disruption, and they sold off. So traders are starting to think, there's nothing here. And so I think, look, we're up $10 a barrel. since the war
Jeg
started.
tror jeg kan kjøre
And so I think there's appropriate amount
Jeg
of
kan kjøre 0,01
holding their breath, waiting to see if Israel
Nei, nå kan jeg kjøre 0,3 nå,
expand
faktisk.
this conflict beyond military
På gull.
and political targets into traded energy. So far, no one's pulled that trigger yet, and if they don't, I can see the price kind of reversing.
Well, so when we consider that, Bob, what kind of spare capacity elsewhere that doesn't have to navigate the Strait of Hormuz or potentially is vulnerable to any kind of Iranian retaliation is there out there for other oil producers who may be able to make up some of the gap at least?
Well, the problem is all of the spare capacity in the world is inside the Strait of Hormuz, mainly in Saudi Arabia, UAE, a little bit Iraq, and Kuwait. Now, there are some options to redirect barrels around the Strait of Hormuz, but it's not a lot. There's the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, about a 5 million barrel a day capacity. Now, they're using a little bit of it now, so maybe they can push 3.5 through that. UAE has a new pipeline, Habshan Fujairah, maybe a million or so through that. So maybe you could, out of the 14 million barrels a day of just crude, not products, but just crude, maybe 3-4 million barrels a day could be redirected around the Strait of Hormuz. But in terms of spare capacity, the bad news is it's all in the war zone.
Bob, you famously helped George Bush refill the SPR, and as we consider the potential need for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve here, if in fact this became a protracted conflict or we saw a massive interruption in production or supplies, what kind of a situation would we be facing with an SPR that's half empty?
Yeah, you know, I hope there's and I expect there's a lot of, reconsideration of the wisdom. And both parties did this initially, of selling down the SPR, as you noted, and then President Biden spilled about half of it for no good reason, really, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So here we are at a little over 400 million barrels. So we have half the capability that we would otherwise. And we're the biggest strategic stockholder in the world after Japan and Germany. So look, I think if we saw an interruption, there would be a coordinated stock release between us and our IEA partners, International Energy Agency partners. But we could maybe do 2 million barrels a day. But again, there's the math problem. We have 14 million barrels a day of just crude, another 6 or so of products. And, that's only going to make a dent. So it's unfortunate, and hopefully if there's a silver lining from all this, Joe, from an energy policy perspective, there will be a bipartisan reconsideration of the wisdom of letting down our guard and our defenses.
And finally, Bob, knowing that you know the Gulf states quite well, they obviously have not reacted positively to the U.S.'s decision-making here. What is their greatest concern right now? What role do you expect that they will play in what happens going forward?
Yeah, the Gulf countries are very concerned that the war will expand to include attacks on key Gulf infrastructure, Abqaiq, Khurais, Ruwais, other big terminals, refineries. They're all there in close proximity.
Gull har kjempemotstand her nå, så hvis han bryter her nå, så vil han bare stikke av. Men så egentlig vil jeg kjøpe litt mer her nå, men siden det er første dagen på gullkontoen, så tar jeg tredje litt rolig.
Is not changing policy from an energy perspective. I think their message is we're going to stay with what we're doing. We're going to lay low.
Jeg skal gjøre den gullkontoen og flere 100% her.
An important voice for us this evening, Bob McNally, the founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. Bob, thank you so much for being with us. President Trump's decision to strike Iran, a major reversal from his campaign promise to be a peacemaker, no new wars. Here's the president during his inaugural address in January.
We will again build the strongest military the world has ever seen. We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into.
Let's assemble this evening's political panel. Ashley Davis is with us, Republican strategist, partner at S3 Group, former special assistant to the Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. Also Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for House Affairs at the State Department under President Obama. We've got a great panel, and welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us here. Ashley, your thought on what we just mentioned. No new wars was the promise. This is what many Trump supporters pointed to as an example of success from the first administration. Did that change today, or can President Trump keep this isolated to one night of strikes?
Det er ikke for sent, Ole. Jeg tenker jeg skal ta ut alt over 500 hver dag, jeg. Så alle kan putte på mer penger hele tiden. Jeg tror kanskje det er løsningen.
Of the MAGA movement, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, that said, you know, we still need to stay out of it, obviously. Other allies like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon. But I think that he'll be able to explain that with Iran, which is a state...
For da blir det prosentvis avkastning, så hvis dere har oppi mer penger, så blir prosentene likt hos dere. Det blir enda mer, faktisk.
I do think that he thinks this is, as many have said yesterday and today, that this is a war on Iran's nuclear weapons, not on Iran. And if it continues to stay just that, I think it will be okay. But if it widens into a broader war, it's yet to be seen.
Yeah, that's a big if, Joel. Do you think the president has political support behind him now, and will that remain if this actually turns into another prolonged conflict?
Well, you know, quite frankly, and it's great to be with you, Ashley, as well. Look, we have a real problem here politically, which is that both parties have large constituencies that do not want any American involvement in military action abroad. Now, I supported the action last night. I think it was the appropriate one at this moment in time. But there needs to be an explanation about what the goals are, what are the limitations, what's the next step for the day after, how are we protecting our forces, how do we deal with, as you're all discussing here, the Straits of Hormuz, other types of potential attacks against our interests. And so that needs to be fleshed out. It can't just be a strike and then move on to the next news cycle. And so in Congress, we're going to see a debate, most likely in the Senate on the floor because of a privileged resolution on the War Powers Act. The House is thinking about it, but I don't think we'll see Speaker Johnson put something on the floor. But that needs to be ventilated, and that will give confidence to the American people that there is a plan and a rationale. If not, the anti-war wings of both parties will continue to raise their voices.
We're going to add another voice to this conversation. In Holly Dagres, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy Program on Iran and U.S. policy. It's great to have you back with us as we consider what's going on inside Iran, the question about the day after. What is Tehran prepared to do? How long will it take?
Thank you for having me on the program. I think we're all waiting for bated breath, whether inside Iran or outside of Iran, to see how they're going to retaliate against these U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. It's really hard to say right now. I think when we war-gamed this over the years, there were numerous things that they were looking at. There was this, the most obvious would be to strike U.S. forces, U.S. bases across the region, to close the Strait of Hormuz, to take dual and foreign citizens hostage, to practice transnational repression, and of course to activate its proxies, which have now very much been maimed in the post-October 7th climate. So this is what we're waiting to see happens, but of course these calculations can change because this is very new territory for the Islamic Republic, but they're also in a fight for their survival.
Well, actually, as Holly mentions, things like hostage taking, when we consider the threat of potentially sleeper cells being activated and terrorism, whether at home here or abroad, if you were still inside the Department of Homeland Security, what would be underway as we speak to try to hedge against that risk?
Yeah, I'm assuming, and for those that remember, I would assume that we are at high alert at the red level back in the days of the color-coded system because of the sleeper cells that are definitely and has been known for many years in our country. I mean, just from the last 4 years alone, and this is not a political statement, just a fact, is that 1,200 Iranians have come into the country that we know of. And so where are those people? Are we able to keep control of it's not just Iran that we have to be watching for, but the other sponsored networks by Iran and the terrorist cells that they have. And so that is the thing that is scary to me the most in regards to our homeland, and there is definitely a high alert in regards to the department right now and obviously the local law enforcement around the country.
You want answers. How long does the Trump administration have before it needs to answer the questions you're asking, or just give a baseline estimate of how much damage was done?
I think the baseline of the bomb damage assessment needs to be relatively soon. I would assume that we are currently investigating using drone technology and other assets on the ground, and that the Israelis.
Can we tell what happened underneath a mountain, though? I mean, do you have to send people down there to find out?
Well, they can tell about radiation, and so the IAEA has said that no radiation has spilled. That's a good thing, and so they're going to be looking at that. My goodness, if it takes too long, it's going to create more turmoil. But regarding timing, much of it, as Holly points out, depends upon the Iranian reaction. If Iran does not physically react in the near term, I think that we'll see a lot of people moving on. But I just can't see that happening where they're completely passive at this moment. There's too much need, as Holly again points out. They are in a fight for their survival. They also internally have to take care of ensuring that this is not a window of opportunity for the opposition to lean in and say that now the regime is destabilized and we can make a move. So there are a lot of factors here that are out of our American control as well that will be driving this timetable.
Well, and when we consider the future of the regime, obviously multiple administration officials have said a regime change is not the objective here, and yet, Holly, earlier this evening, President Trump takes to Truth Social to say the following, quote, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change?" Holly, do you have an answer to his question? Why wouldn't there be?
I mean, from what we're understanding from President Trump's public statements is that he still is open to negotiating, to stopping this war from going on. But at this juncture, it's hard to imagine the Iranians sitting at a table when they were supposed to sit across Steve Witkoff just 3 days before the strikes began. And then, of course, everything's history now. So I think that just to tell them, hey, we've struck your nuclear program and now, like, we expect you to sit down with us, I think that's really hard to believe that the Iranians would be open to right now. What they think they would very much be pushing for is some sort of ceasefire. But on the topic of regime change, I just want to know, we're not just hearing this from U.S. President Donald Trump, we're also hearing this from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He put out a public statement calling on the Iranian people to rise up and change their regime. We also heard that from former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. The name of the operation is Rising Lion. Rising Lion, of course, is a biblical reference officially, but it also is a dog whistle. It's a dog whistle to a life in Iran pre-1979, and the tweets that the IDF has been putting out in Persian includes actual images of a lion and a sun.
Jeg tredde på begge kontoene, Geir, men nå tredde jeg på gullkontoen.
So this whole idea that maybe Trump is just saying something, I think that there's something hidden between this messaging right now. We just don't know because they haven't targeted political leadership thus far.
Ashley Davis, I want to tap your experience as an expert in homeland security as we consider the possibility of an asymmetric attack, questions about the day after. How prepared is the U.S. for a terror attack here at home?
The scariest thing about a terror attack here in the United States is not knowing how they're going to attack you. So are we ready for someone taking over a plane again? Yes. Are we ready for suitcase bombs in the middle of New York? Yes. Are we ready for someone going into a Starbucks in Iowa and blowing themselves up? How do you ever predict that? So I think that there are big things that we have and are better than we were pre-9/11, but there's still a long way to go. We still do not have the capability of interoperability between our law enforcement on a state and local level and our federal forces. We're getting better, but it's 24, 25 years later, and we're still not up to capacity. And as I said at the beginning here, and this is just the unknown, the scariest part of a terrorist attack is the unknown of what they are going to attack. And also, let's go back to COVID. If we have some sort of biological agent that is dispersed throughout our country, are we ready look at how we dealt with COVID throughout the country and the world. Are we ready to deal with a biological weapon? Not too sure about that.
All right, Ashley Davis, we appreciate it, as well as Joel Rubin and Holly Dagres, all of you. We appreciate your time and insights today on this special edition of Balance of Power. And on a programming note, this conversation will continue tomorrow on Bloomberg Surveillance, where at 8:15 a.m. Eastern Time, they'll have a live interview with Danny Deneau, Israel's ambassador.
Grafene bak meg.
We'll get back here as well, of course.
Hæ? Ikke det synlig nå?
The early edition and will
Nei, ingenting.
5 p.m. Eastern Time.
Herregud, kødder du, eller? Hvorfor er ikke det synlig, da?
Det er bakgrunnsbilder på skjermene.
Har jeg brukt så lang tid for å ha alt klart, og så ser man det ikke? Jeg er så lei, jeg. Jeg er så lei det amatør-driten her. Jeg har...
Der, ja. Mangler jeg ikke.
Sånn, ikke sant?
Ja.
Perfekt.
This villa, very traditional.
Ja, man har 1500 for å få 02.
Things of the past.
I live my very first independent life in the farmhouse, and I built it by the memory of the farmhouse, the philosophy they believe, yin yang 5 elements, the concept of the life, of the happiness. They build this kind of roof like boat.
Hva er det som skjer med Nasdaq? Altså, jeg trader ikke Nasdaq nå, jeg blir bare irritert. Hva er det som skjer med Nasdaq?
Forsteng det short her, da. Hvorfor er ikke Nasdaq ned sånn 500 poeng i dag? Hvorfor liksom? Hvorfor i det hele tatt er den ikke med? Hvorfor er den ikke med ned?
There's an appreciation for what you have now.
And therefore, peace is the most important thing for today, for Vietnamese, and I think for human beings, for the world.
I'm Alex Rodriguez. And I'm Jason Kelly. And we're back with more episodes of our show, The Deal.
The theme of this season, On the Road. We're bringing you more behind-the-scenes conversations with the biggest names in sports, business, and culture, like Melody Hobson.
I started to study women's sports like an 11-year-old studies baseball statistics, and I got dangerous in seeing up arrows.
Susie Wolf.
When you're competing, you're not thinking about any fear or any worries of what could happen.
Josh Harris.
You can't do a good deal with a bad person.
Jay Bath.
At the end of the day, there's never been a better time to be a student athlete.
And more. Stay tuned.
Our global headquarters in New York, I'm Danny Berger. Welcome to Bloomberg Brief. Let's set your agenda.
Bloomberg Brief delivers the market news, data, and analysis you need live every weekday only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute geopolitical news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Joanna Versace in Doha, Qatar, and this is Bloomberg.
Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
Fears of a wider war in the Middle East after the US military strike on Iran. This is the Asia Trade. I'm Avril Hong in Singapore.
I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts in Sydney. The world now awaiting a response from Tehran after US warplanes used bunker-busting bombs to strike the Iranian regime's key nuclear sites. We're already seeing that oil price jump as trade begins here in Asia. Gold, the dollar higher, US stock futures declining as investors rush to safety. The Strait of Hormuz is now in focus, with Iran's parliament calling for a blockade of the waterway that's crucial to global oil trade. The Trump administration calling that a suicidal move.
The first people that should be angry about it are the Chinese government, because they take a lot of their oil comes through there. So they should be the first ones that are saying if they mine the Straits of Hormuz, the Chinese are going to pay a huge price. And every other country in the world is going to pay a huge price. We will too. It'll have some impact on us. It'll have a lot more impact on the rest of the world. A lot more impact on the rest of the world. It would be a suicidal move on their part.
The US has said the strikes obliterated Iran's nuclear capabilities, but were not about toppling the regime. Still, President Trump has been musing on just that topic in a social media post, asking why there wouldn't be a regime change. We've also heard from Iran's foreign minister, accusing the US of betraying diplomacy.
The world must not forget that it was the United States which, in the midst of a process to forge a diplomatic outcome, betrayed diplomacy by supporting the genocidal Israeli regime's launch of an illegal war of aggression on the Iranian nation.
Let's get straight to the White House now. Our Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall is with us. So Tyler, give us a state of play in terms of what we're at the moment, clearly watching for the next move from Tehran, but also some interesting ponderings from the president when it comes to this prospect of regime change.
Right, so we haven't seen President Trump today, but that doesn't mean that we haven't heard from him in a flurry of posts on Truth Social. You mentioned one of them there, though we should say at the moment it's not totally clear what conditions or circumstances the U.S. would need to see when it comes to getting behind a regime change. But the U.S. by and large has touted this operation as being successful, in which no U.S. military service members were lost and Iran didn't fire at U.S. military assets. But one of the big questions that we are still waiting for additional details on include the full extent of the damage at
Var forsvarlig på en konto på $500, 0,03 eller 0,04 eller 5.
Ja, jeg sier det.
President J.D. Vance did say that the U.S. feels confident that it has set back Iran's timeline when it comes to trying to develop a nuclear weapon and their nuclear ambitions, but he also did signal that Iran still holds on to a stockpile when it comes to enriched uranium. Now, the big thing for the U.S. going forward here is that they want to spur these talks with Iran, with President Trump threatening further action if Iran doesn't come to the negotiating table. But the thing is that we've heard from Iranian officials today, and they have reiterated that they're not going to enter into these talks unless the strikes against them halt first. Now, the U.S. is preparing and anticipating any sort of Iranian retaliation, and we should say that could look like a few different options that are on the table, but our analysts at Bloomberg say that it actually may end up being tempered reasons. That includes a weak economy, also domestic discontent, but also importantly that we haven't really seen much from Iran's strategic allies beyond rhetorical support, and that of course includes China, which, as you mentioned at the top of the program, is one of the top importers when it comes to Iranian oil.
Tyler, what else are we hearing from Washington? There have been some concerns about whether this move was constitutional. What are we hearing?
Right, so this really has to deal with something known as the War Powers Act of 1973. We're going to hear it come up a lot this week in Washington.
Ja, altså jeg tok jo 0,03 da, så får dere det samme som meg. 0,03 var den ene posisjonen jeg tok nå. 0,03. Jeg synes 0,01 var litt lite.
Secretary Pete Hegseth said that they did notify the leaders, House Speaker Mike Johnson and John Thune, immediately after the mission was complete. But it is raising questions here about the president's authority, since it really does fall to Congress when it comes to declaring war. But we should say that presidents of both parties in the past have used their authority when it comes to targeted military action.
particularly since 9/11, right? It does go to the question, does this sort of create further divisions within the GOP at a time when it is pretty fragile for President Trump? What is his sort of support looking like, both within the party but also to his base, you know, a lot of which sort of believed him when he said that there would be no new wars?
Right, it definitely threatens to deepen a rift that we are seeing when it comes to the GOP, considering that President Trump did campaign on getting the US out of foreign entanglements. But importantly,
det med handel er at du
backers when it came to that idea of more an isolationist approach.
Her kom gull falle, sier du. Da har han allerede falt med $10. Så det lille du ser her nå, det er kanskje en liten rest på $5. Kanskje maks. Kan droppe ned til 70-ish, som vi snakket om I stad.
To this issue, he has tried to make that point that he is acting with as much knowledge as he has, and that the White House has said that he has actually always called for the end of Iran's nuclear program, and that's where that messaging, particularly about a potential regime change, would get really interesting, because the White House's defense to the base so far is that this is all about
Vi var faen meg helt oppe på 94, ass. Faen, ass, at ikke jeg fikk solgt alt der oppe I sted. Helvete, ass. Jeg hadde 0,4 kontrakter, Robert, I sted.
Jeg har 0,4.
This is a fast evolving situation. What would you say is the most important thing to be watching in the next couple of hours on the course of the conflict?
Well, we're definitely watching to see how Iran could potentially retaliate here, and there's a few different ways that this situation could escalate if Iran ends up choosing to really go hard when it comes to their response. One would be hitting energy infrastructure in the region, the other would be targeting U.S. assets or personnel in the region, but the third, of course, as you were talking about before, would be closing the Strait of Hormuz, where we know 20% of global oil flows go through
Joakim, jeg ser på 1, 2, 3, 6 forskjellige timeframes.
That would take a decision from Iran's supreme leader, but that would have really big consequences here, particularly for their strategic allies like China, and it's something where the U.S. would also likely have a response, since this is going to also be a political pressure point for this White House, considering President Trump campaigned so heavily on bringing down the costs, particularly when it comes to energy. Now, we did hear from some U.S. officials pointing out that it wouldn't be economically viable for Iran, considering that they would be impacting their own
15 minutter, akkurat nå.
The world awaits Iran's response. Tyler, thanks so much. Bloomberg's Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall for us.
Jeg justerer det hele tiden, Joakim.
Director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. He previously served as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East at the U.S. National Intelligence Council. Really good to have you with us. First off, it's really difficult to overstate the significance of now having U.S. involvement, but what's your initial assessment about how this is going to shape the conflict?
Thanks for having me. Oh, look, I think it's really going to be dependent on what Iran's response is, just as Tyler alluded to a moment ago. I think there's really two ways to think through this. One is, if the Iranians decide that they are pragmatic,
Viking Power, ja.
Trying to ensure regime survival, which has always been the regime's priority, then there's a chance that Iran is going to look to hit and target U.S. bases in the region, U.S. assets in the region, but do so in a way that limits damage, as well as ensures that there's really no...
Nå bare teste marginer litt der, så jeg ser hva jeg kan gjøre for noe.
There is some precedent for that. So in terms of how Iran responded to Israeli attacks in October of last year, and the base that it hit, but also how Iran responded to Trump's decision to kill Qasem Soleimani, the former Quds Force chief, back in January of 2020. That's the type of action they took. The flip side is that the Iranians say, look, the regime is under threat, we're at risk, close the Strait of Hormuz, they target U.S. assets and personnel in the region, you have significant deaths, and then we end up into really an escalatory spiral in which the U.S. is compelled to respond.
How far do you think Washington would go? I mean, what is the end game, you think, in that event for the Trump administration?
Ja, så sitt våken.
Om vi gjør da.
Is that they're
Fikk meg noen fin short på gull, dere. Og en fin long på Nasdaq.
Du så på sentimentet.
Ja. Ikke bare det da, men ja. Jeg fløy både opp og ned.
Ja, jeg solgte nesten på toppen.
Ja, det fint. Ja, for du var long siden fredagen, du.
Ja, jeg tjente masse penger. Men det irriterer meg, for PC-en min, alt låste seg her.
Aha.
Da ble jeg helt fitte irritert. Så jeg hadde gevinst på den på nesten 9000, så fikk jeg tatt ut bare 5. Det var litt irriterende.
Ja, det er litt Men 5 noe penger det også. Okay.
Ja, men jeg hadde 9000 liksom. Og planen min var jo perfekt, men så fikk jeg ikke logget meg på for jeg var sein, og så slo ikke den PC seg på, og så funket ikke den OBS-en, og så var ikke bildet på riktig, og så var han som skulle hjelpe meg i dusjen, og bare kaos.
Jeg skulle opp deg i dusjen?
Nei, han som kan hele oppsettet her var i dusjen.
Ja.
Jeg satt der som sånn dust, men nå får jeg bra oppsett oppe, så nå slipper jeg å være avhengig av noen. Nå kan man trykke på en knapp, og så er jeg oppe og går. Det blir litt lettere for meg, vet jeg. Det som er veldig festlig her, er at Nasdaq går opp og gull er svagt når det er krig. Det er det mest teiteste jeg har sett i hele mitt liv.
Ja, jeg sa når vi gapp opp til 87 på fredagen, og vi gjorde jo det, så det er helgen her, da, vi solgte. Nasdaq var lite volum, synes jeg.
Det er ikke noe volum, det. Ikke på S&P heller.
Nei, så nei, vi fortsetter vel sikkert opp, da. Vi tror det. Jeg må ta ut noen shorter i hvert fall, folk som er short.
It certainly could. Look, there's obviously been this question of regime change and whether part of the Israeli calculus is regime change. I think President Trump's...
Jeg tror hele verden har short Nasdaq nå.
I'm sure social are going to add some curiosity to this in terms of whether the U.S. is changing its position. But the regime change is a bit of a double-edged sword. I think there's certainly a potential that, you know, what comes next in Iran is not democracy, but IRGC-istan. In other words, you have almost a military junta-like dictatorship with a fig leaf to the current theocratic autocracy. I think that would certainly be potentially hardliner because you'd be having individuals jockeying for power, jockeying for position, and in order to secure them, usually what happens in these types of situations is people become more extreme, not less, to show that they are alone and can convince hardliners and can actually have the forces, the Quds forces, the army, they're backing that, they're worthy of it. So I think there is a real challenge here, there is a real risk.
Solgt med 3D-greier da?
Ja, fikk jo faktisk en bestilling i dag på nøkkelringen.
Ja.
Har jo vært litt sånn mummigreier.
Ja, det er populært, det har jeg skjønt.
Hæ?
Jeg har skjønt at det er blitt veldig populært.
Ja, nå sjekker
I think most of the Gulf states publicly are going to condemn what you saw in terms of the U.S. attacks, but do so gently. I think privately behind the scenes, the messaging from at least some of them is going to be significantly different. But the reality is they're all quite concerned about the potential for Iranian missiles or rockets raining down on their countries, even bases in their countries.
Ja, det var en lampe.
Headquartered at Manama is a really good example of this.
Men da har du koblet til lys inne, ikke sant?
Iranian missiles targeting U.S. personnel and assets in their country. The second part of this is, look, there is what happens with the Strait of Hormuz. You noted the president had voted to close it. That really doesn't mean much. The truth of the matter is you've got a fifth of the world's oil running through the straits, about a quarter
How
of
it's still-
LNG. It will skyrocket prices, and yes, it will be a problem for the Chinese who are very much reliant on it, but it depends on how long it's for. It could also create pressure in that the Iranians want to do this to try to get the Chinese to serve as their
Du sitter oppe en natt, eller?
pressure the
Ja.
US in order to try to get to a resolution much more quickly.
Jeg legger meg etterpå om jeg skal se noe om, for gull bør stikke av nå.
Jonathan, before we let you go, is it too soon to write off?
Ja, sånn når Asia åpner.
It's not too soon. They're diminished but not out. I think proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas are unlikely to engage at this point if they haven't already in a meaningful way. But Iran has significant proxies in terms of Iraqi Shia militants, and there are still U.S. forces in Iraq.
Altså, oljeprisen har gått rett opp her.
Of a reaction or response, I should
USA skal ned, liksom. Så er det ingenting som henger på greip.
Den er rimelig avkjørt, denne dama. Alt er langt ned.
Skal jeg ta litt med gevinst nå? Jeg kommer til å kjøre hel haug med scalps på koppen nå, bare så du vet det. Det blir masse sånne gevinster. Små og store.
Jonathan Hanikoff is a director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Coming up next on the Asia
Ja,
Today,
68,
we'll
Nico.
look at how these developments
Ja.
across the region are impacting the global economy with the IMF chief Kristalina Georgieva, plus analysis with the former US ambassador to Iraq and Kuwait and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Much more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
Jeg er faktisk opp 60% på den kontoen her nå.
Mye har du der da?
Nei, det var jo $100 som jeg fikk.
Ja. Tredje du gull eller Nasdaq?
Begge to.
Hvor stor posisjon tar du på $100 da? Nei, du tar bare 0,01.
Jeg fikk ikke 0,01, men jeg tok 0,07.
Hæ? Går ikke 0,01?
Ikke på, jeg hadde $142, og det gikk ikke 0,1 da.
Nei, ikke 0,1, men 0,01.
Ja, nei, jeg tar 0,07 da.
Ok. Ja, for nå har jeg 5.000 kroner og handler med 0,04. Det blir litt lite da.
Jeg kjører litt heftig da.
Ja.
Bringing you up to the minute geopolitical news whenever and wherever it happens.
Jo,
I'm
hallo.
David Gura in Ottawa, Canada, and this is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg brings you breaking news 24 hours a day. Powered by more than 3,000 journalists and analysts in more than 100 bureaus across the globe. Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
Morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the US market's close to the
Det er mye giring på det du kjører nå, Stig.
you need to know to kickstart Europe's trading
Hæ?
day. Live
Det er mye giring på det du kjører.
we bring you the day's top
Hva
market
giringen er?
unmatched
Hæ?
expert analysis and on the
Nei, det
ground
er
reporting
200.
from across the continent.
Ja, det tror
Tune
jeg.
in to Daybreak Europe only on
På den
Bloomberg Television.
$100-kontoen jeg på andre så har jeg 500.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg Television?
Så at giringen har så hadde mye å si. Sånn sett.
Fikser 1000 i giring.
Ja, det tror jeg.
Bloomberg Television. Top experts, great questions.
Så eneste forskjellen er at jeg kan ta flere posisjoner.
Technology is embedded in every aspect of our lives and laying the foundation for the future, from finance to defense, AI to
Og hvis du bare trener breakouts, så er det jo smart å ha så høy giring, da, sånn egentlig.
Jo da. Helt til det ikke fungerer, så er det jo...
Ja, da er det bare.
in Tokyo. Watch Bloomberg Tech Asia premieres June 27th only on Bloomberg Television.
We're watching for the market fallout amid the U.S. involvement in Israel's attack against Iran and looking at some safe haven bids now. The dollar is gaining ground almost all its G10 peers and a bit of a risk-off when it comes to US futures. For more on how markets as they open in Asia, we go across to Bloomberg editor Romain Bostic.
Ja, han ligger også og surrer på det samme nå. 70-74.
Today. I mean, how much has already been priced in to the markets?
Well, quite a bit. I mean, here in the U.S., keep in mind that stock indexes had been down about 1.5% or so. Remember, a lot of this sort of started when we had those first strikes by Israel on Iran. That was late on June 12th U.S. time. And then when markets opened on June 13th, you saw a big sell-off there. You saw a huge spike in oil. Remember, Brent crude has rallied about 20% just over the past 2.5 weeks or so. So a lot of this was baked into the market. You were just looking at U.S. futures.
An
hour and a half ago.
Ses som morgon.
I did see a big spike lower, down about 1%, but most of those losses were paired pretty quickly. You saw a similar story when it came to what happened in the commodity space, a big spike higher, about 4% or so on Brent and WTI crude, and that peeled back just a little bit. There's a lot of what ifs out there right now, Avril, and that's really what this market has to contend with. The big question is, what is going to be the response by Iran? On top of that, people want to know, well, what are we going to hear from Europe? What are we going to hear from China? What are we going to hear from Japan? I think when we start to get a little bit more
Oljeprisen fortsetter videre oppover.
What do world leaders have to say about this? What Iran's retaliation could potentially be, and of course, what the U.S. and Israeli response would be to that. I think you might get some more definitive moves in the market.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, the kind of muted moves that we're seeing at the moment, particularly not a lot of gains when it comes to bond havens, right? Is there a possibility that these markets could rally if there is sort of, you know, a confirmation that we have
tjent 600. Och så bra, Nico.
Destroyed, because that the verdict and the evidence is still out on that.
It's still out on that, but two people actually raised this to me. I found it kind of surprising. I spoke with two market strategists here in the U.S. Earlier this afternoon, and they basically said that, look, one of the biggest risks to stability in the Middle East has been Iran, whether it was its nuclear program or its funding of various proxy militias around the region. If those elements have indeed been obliterated or at least significantly tamped down, and if there is confirmation of that from a credible source, that removes a major risk. And a case in point, I think, is what you've seen over the last few days in Israel's benchmark index. That's the Tel Aviv 35. It's on a 6-day run. Remember, it trades Sunday through Thursday, and it closed on Sunday at a record high.
Romain, what about the safe haven of choice at this point? Are bonds definitively going to benefit less from such a play
I think right
than
now,
the dollar?
Yeah, well, as far as bonds go, I think this is also a situation where a lot of that was priced into U.S. Treasuries. We should also point out that U.S. Treasuries are having to contend with a lot of other things, such as the fiscal situation and other domestic issues that are going to have a greater impact than the Middle East issues. But FX is going to be the big play here. You are seeing strength in the dollar here. Surprisingly, you're not seeing as much strength as some people thought we would have in the yen or even in the Swiss franc. Maybe ratification that despite all of the talk about the demise of the dollar, it is still viewed as a haven asset, as a benchmark asset, as of course it is the most liquid and in the eyes of a lot of people, of course, it offers the most stability. So maybe that ends up being a beneficiary. Of course, we should point out the dollar on a year-to-date basis having one of the worst starts to a year in its history.
The very quick pricing of the spiralling conflict is taking place for markets, but I do wonder what sort of catalyst are we looking for that to potentially then feed into the next thing, which is whether the Fed or other central banks change their calculus when it comes to inflation.
It all has to do with inflation and whether we see a sustained spike in oil prices. Remember, they are elevated. We're trading right around $79 a barrel on Brent crude. And remember, we haven't been at these levels since basically early January. So at a time where everyone is worried about the potential for inflation, a sustained increase in those prices. And remember, it's not just oil prices, but natural gas prices as well. Both two commodities, of course, that are heavily dependent on those shipping lanes coming out of Hormuz. And a big question right now is whether Iran will or even has the capability of choking up that strait and preventing the supply of oil and gas from flowing out of the region. If that is the case, most of the strategists here on Wall Street have modeled in above $90, even maybe potentially approaching $100 a barrel. And yes, that would be an inflationary shock, and that would be something that central banks, including the Fed, would have to deal with.
Romain, do the moves in crypto tell us anything about sort of the underlying sentiment that we're seeing here?
Yeah, the moves in crypto were quite interesting. We actually saw a pretty big drop earlier in the session here on Sunday morning in the United States. Ether was the biggest drop, down about 10%. Bitcoin plunged about 6 to 7%. You're seeing the numbers now on your screen. This is the new session. Basically, we did see a little bit of an uptick. Bitcoin back above the 100,000 level, but it adds to this question about whether it really is being traded as a haven asset or whether it still remains a speculative asset. And I think the drop down that we saw early in the session was maybe indicative of the idea that it is still a speculative asset, at least for a lot of those folks who trade it. And when risk was off, as it was earlier in the session, we saw prices down, but now with risk maybe potentially coming back on, you see prices modestly elevated.
Remain great to have you with us. Our Bloomberg editor and co-anchor of The Close, Remain Bostic there with a look at those markets as Asia wakes up for their reaction.
Live hver dag, Joakim.
You can get more on TLI if you go on the terminal for the latest commentary analysis from our editors. This is Bloomberg.
Hver eneste dag.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories that we're following this hour. And British Airways at the moment is in focus as we continue to monitor really some of the geopolitical risks that we're seeing at the moment. Of course, we're watching to see
Jeg skal trede den kontoen mange 1000% opp.
From Iran after the flurry of US attacks over the weekend. But take a look at what we're watching when it comes to the aviation space. We saw the cancellation from BA of several flights to Dubai, including diverting 2 planes. It also halted some flights to Qatar and Bahrain. Singapore Airlines cancelling 2 flights on Sunday between Singapore and Dubai, warning that other flights may also be affected. Major US cities, including New York, Washington, and Los Angeles, are tightening security after Iran warned that it was reserving all options to respond to the US strikes. Police have increased patrols at religious institutions, diplomatic facilities, and public spaces. Officials say no credible threats currently exist, but are urging people to be vigilant. Ukraine says Russia is showing no signs of winding down its war in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military's commander-in-chief says Russia still has almost 700,000 troops deployed and another 121,000 in strategic reserves. And President Volodymyr Zelensky has alleged that Kyiv has evidence that Moscow is preparing new military operations on European territory without giving further details, April.
Yeah, the focus still really is on what Iran's response to the U.S. moves over the weekend is going to look like. We're seeing a bit of a risk-off, a third of a percent down when it comes to U.S. futures. It's interesting, though, a lot of it has seemed to already have been priced into the market. This is Bloomberg.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield around the world right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Key investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with favorite newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Anand, only on Bloomberg.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action.
We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest every trading day, only on Bloomberg.
Join me each week on Wall Street Week for stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
take a look at what we're watching when it comes to oil prices at the moment. It's interesting. It almost feels like the calm potentially before the next round of volatility, as we have seen some of the tops when it comes to oil potentially looking a little bit more baked in after that US attack on Iran. The spike is sort of ramping up the risk to supplies there, of course, as we saw those 3 main nuclear sites being attacked over the weekend. We saw a rally when it comes to benchmark Brent of just shy of about 6% there, but really it does dramatically raise the expectations of confrontation. Potentially the threat to the Strait of Hormuz as well is what we're watching at the moment, given some of the domestic conversation within Iran about a possible blockade. But this is what we're seeing across the region as Asia starts to price in some of those risks. Let's get more on the perspectives when it comes to oil markets amid these ongoing tensions. Joining us now in Sydney is Claudio Galimberti, who's the chief economist at Rystad Energy. Claudio, great to have you.
Nei, jeg trader egentlig hele tiden, altså.
We are off session highs at the moment, still noticeably higher from the highs of last week. So what does that tell you about the mentality of what we're seeing amongst oil traders right now?
Thank you for inviting us. It tells me that there is a huge geopolitical risk premium which keeps on increasing. So it was just before the US attack about $10 per barrel. And right now there is a risk it can go up as high as $15 per barrel in the course of today. So initial price reaction is still, I would say, muted to some extent. So we started at 78, it was 75 at closure on Friday. So it's about $2-3 higher. It could be much higher, depending on what Iran decides to do.
And that obviously has to do with whether or not we see a partial or complete blockade of Hormuz.
Correct.
What risk do you assign to that, and what do you see as the impact? Obviously, it impacts different importers in different ways.
Well, the parliament in Iran just stated that they should go for the blockade of Hormuz. And now this is
Se, Nasdaq går da. Den går mer enn gull.
Straight, right? So the we need to understand the fact that no one would benefit from it, not even Iran itself, because the export of Iran goes through the Strait of Hormuz. But this is an extreme situation, right? So Iran has been attacked, and the regime might want to retaliate. And retaliation at this point, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the prime targets. So we need to watch very closely. 30% of the oil and water goes to the Strait of Hormuz. So any form of disruption would have a very, very significant.
Where do oil prices go if we have that worst case scenario?
It can go anywhere, between 80 to 90, even $100 per barrel. It depends on the extent of the disruption. It depends on the duration, right? So from this standpoint, we still believe that a full blocking on the strait would be extremely hard to implement. It requires a lot of military equipment, but it's also you would have pretty much the entire world against it, because no one benefits from choking this, probably one of the most vital strait for the world economy, right? So the country that would be fully against it is China, and China is one of the allies of Iran right now, right? So China and Russia have been on Iran's side, and therefore China for sure wouldn't be for such an occurrence. And that tells me that it's definitely a tail event, but we need to be very much aware that this could happen. And if that happens, then you can have a price flare up that can be extremely high. It can be in the Brent can go in triple digit. It depends, right, on how much oil gets disrupted. So,
Claudio, since you mentioned China, how much pressure do you think Beijing would be able to exert on Tehran if it decides to choke off the Strait of Hormuz? Again, as you say, this is a very extreme course of action and might not actually materialize. But you know, what are we actually talking about here when it comes to China and Iran?
So currently China buys everything, all the oil exported by Iran is bought by China. We're talking about 1.4 million barrels per day. Therefore, we may argue that pretty much there is a huge financial dependence of Iran, when it comes to China. So the pressure there is a multiple front. Consider that Iran has these allies that are Russia and China primarily. And the situation is very complicated, but I would say that the blockage of the Straits of Hormuz is going to be very hard. But we need to consider that as one of the potential for the next few days. And specifically when it comes to the retaliation by Iran, that's not the only thing they can do. They can target other oil facility in the region. So, and the region produces a huge amount of oil. You have, of course, the UAE, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Kuwait, and so on and so forth, and you have Iraq. Now, the United States was very clear yesterday, any form of retaliation would be met with extreme force. So that, of course, increases the risk of a flare-up and of potential damage to oil facility in the region.
Even as we wait to see what Iran will ultimately do, we've already been seeing some signal disruptions, other sorts of disruptions as well in the Strait, maybe also because of shipping concerns going into the waterway. How much disruption are we ultimately already seeing at the moment?
So, I mean, what we've seen is that first of all, ships now tend to go through the Strait of Hormuz on the Omani side, right? So this is the first and obviously the easiest thing to do. What we've seen is that some ships have been diverted, so they decided not to go through the Straits for the risk of being targeted. So up until the weekend, we hadn't seen any disruption in the flow. So that's the reason why the price was obviously we had a very high news premium, but not extremely high. But what happened over the weekend clearly changes completely the dynamics, because right now we have the United States has entered the war on the side of Israel and against Iran, and this changes completely the dynamics, and therefore the situation is now completely changed. So we could see, as a matter of fact, a huge decrease in the flow of oil over the next couple of weeks. So we just need to monitor. At this point, it's so early that it's very difficult to assess, but what we can expect is that there's going to be a lot of volatility in the market in the next couple of weeks for sure.
Claudio, what do you think the likely response from OPEC Plus is going to be?
So OPEC Plus, this is very important, because what we have seen is that of course, we are going through an extremely volatile period in the Middle East. This is Israel attacked Iran already 2 weeks ago. And what we have said is that the OPEC Plus is a lot of spare capacity. So we're talking about almost 6 million barrels a day of production, which is kept offline as a result of the successive production cuts that the organization made over the past 3 years. So this is a very important cushion, because imagine there is 100,000 barrels per day are basically taken out, but there is this 6 million barrels a day of capacity that can come online at any point in time. The problem, though, is that it all sits on north of the Strait of Hormuz. So even if this spare capacity is brought back online, it still need to go through the Strait of Hormuz. So this is very important to bear in mind. But it is a fact that at least we have the ability to deploy some capacity by OPEC Plus, which is considerable. Also, very important, Saudi Arabia can direct some of its production from east to west using a pipeline, bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. Also, the United Emirates, they can use a pipeline to Fujairah to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, there is the ability to kind of address any problem through the Strait of Hormuz, but it's not going to be the 20 million barrels a day that go through the Strait of Hormuz on a daily basis. probably you can redirect 6 to 7 million barrels per day. So it's Strait of Hormuz remains an extremely important deal right now at this point.
Right. That's a key point, having the spare capacity, but what about having it move around where it needs to go? Claudio Galimbati, Chief Economist at Rystad. Angie, thank you so much for your insights. Now, China has criticized the U.S. strike on Iranian nuclear facilities, saying again that it's willing to join international efforts to restore peace in the Middle East. And U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is calling on Beijing to ensure Iran keeps the Strait of Hormuz open.
Well, I would encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. And we retain options to deal with that. But other countries should be looking at that as well. It would hurt other countries' economies a lot worse than ours.
Let's bring in our China correspondent, Min Lo, for us. So, Min, what are we hearing exactly from the Chinese side?
Yes, China has condemned the U.S. attack on Iran's nuclear sites. We know that China has previously called on the U.S. to do more to calm the conflict, but I guess attacking the nuclear sites isn't exactly China's vision of calming the conflict. In fact, there is a Global Times editorial that really criticized how the U.S. is escalating the conflict even more by entering the fray and using more higher level weapons to escalate things even further and destabilizing the region. And China says that Iran will likely see this as an act of provocation. It could threaten to spill over this conflict to the wider region. So China is extremely against this move from the US. But of course, analysts are saying that the fact that US is engaged in this war in Iran, it is a distraction for Washington from the strategic competition with China. So that's a side benefit that China could reap from this in some ways. But China's stand is still the same as before. They strongly condemn the attack from Israel and from the US. They continue to call on all parties, especially Israel, to cease fire and says that they are willing to do what they can to mediate or facilitate peace and stability in the region, but nothing beyond that rhetorical support so far.
Yeah, it's interesting that no sort of meaningful support has really been given in terms of beyond normal trade relations, right? But what do we know in terms of the outsized impact that any sort of Strait of Hormuz blockade would have on China in particular?
Yes, China relies on the Middle East for nearly half of its energy needs, and as you heard from the analysts earlier, China imports almost all of Iran's oil, crude oil, and so it does have some leverage over Iran, and as Marco Rubio also mentioned, it is in some ways economic suicide for Iran if it closes that Strait of Hormuz, given that 85% of Iran's exports come from its energy exports. So it's a very sort of critical choke point here. And as the analyst said, it could be quite difficult for Iran to actually close that. Iran controls the northern side of that Strait of Hormuz, and Saudi Arabia, Qatar controls the southern side of the strait. But China right now, according to official statistics, Russia is still China's largest source of energy imports, and it does have imports from other countries in the Middle East. And as the analyst mentioned as well, there are these alternative pipelines that Saudi Arabia and Emirates have. Although the capacity is limited, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, they can free up additional about 2.6 million barrels of oil per day on average, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to what the Strait of Hormuz handles a day, about 20 million barrels a day. So, of course, markets are already pricing in the risk of potential disruption to oil flows.
Makes China correspondent Min Lo there with the latest. More ahead on the Asia trade, this is Bloomberg.
to Bloomberg Business Week Daily.
We got to talk crypto.
From the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead.
What's the conversation around your company?
Bringing you insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy.
Planning very big things.
A new level of premium.
Plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens.
The floodgates of innovation are going to open up.
You can't fake passion. You either are or you aren't.
Bloomberg Business Week Daily, only on Bloomberg.
Making money isn't about drowning in emotions. It's about understanding what's actually happening. Markets are the best way to glean signal from noise, and that is what we try to do every morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Bloomberg loves earnings.
I know it's like your Super Bowl, right?
I can't wait. It's like opening presents in the morning.
All right, it will be exciting.
Nobody covers earnings like Bloomberg.
Take a look at how we're setting up. We're just 15 minutes away from the start of cash trading here in Australia. We're seeing decidedly lower outlook when it comes to Asian stocks, likely to really follow the track of US futures lower there as well, as we continue to watch what goes on with the Strait of Hormuz and those risks to global oil flows as the Israel, Iran and now US involvement in this conflict continues. Well, the International Monetary Fund will also be closely watching the impact of the US strike on Iran. Let's get over to Tokyo. Our Goa Kasharian is standing by with our next special guest. Sherry.
And Heidi, perhaps lower and more pressure on the global economy, given, of course, the ongoing uncertainty, not only from geopolitical tensions, but also from the trade environment. Joining me now here is the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva. Managing Director, great to have you here in Tokyo. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's very difficult to say right now how these geopolitical tensions in the Middle East will unfold. But at this point, what is the IMF watching very closely on how this could impact the global economy?
We are looking at this as another source of uncertainty in what has been a highly uncertain environment. And we are watching for two things. One, how would that impact risk premia for oil and gas? There has been some movement upward. How far would it go? And two, would there be any disruption in energy supplies? For now, no. But let's see how events would develop, whether either the delivery routes or spillovers to other countries may occur. I pray no.
Right. Is the transmission mechanism the channels where you're seeing the biggest Middle East shock in energy prices at the moment?
It is in energy prices, yes. Of course, there could be secondary and tertiary impact. Let's say there is more turbulence that goes into hitting growth prospects of large economies. And then you have a trigger impact in a downward revision of prospects for global growth. As you know, we have already revised the downward growth projections for this year. And we will be coming up with our next projections in July. So far, what we see in the first 2 quarters of the year broadly confirms the picture we have painted in April. And it is somewhat slower global growth, but no recession.
Especially when it comes to the United States, you also upped the potential of recession risk in your last update in April.
Indeed, indeed. We went up to nearly 40% risk of recession. Yet, when you look at the probabilities, still there is a higher probability that US in this year may avoid recession. But please, let's not rock the boat any further.
Especially given that we have inflationary risk as well, right? Given that we do not know where energy prices will end up being, but at the same time, given the transmission mechanism, is stagflation risk in the US a real concern?
For now, we see the disinflation in the United States continuing, but not to a point in which the Fed feels comfortable to cut interest rates.
Fan trött över oss.
What we expect towards the end of the year is possibly for the Fed we are not seeing dramatic change.
Den Nasdaqen gir faen meg null mening, ass. Irriterer meg.
Remains strong. We see
Jeg kjøpte ut gull her nede også.
Increase in pay. What does it translate into? Consumers feeling more comfortable to spend. But the more there is uncertainty, the more there is volatility, the worse it is for business. When there is uncertainty, what happens? Investors don't invest, consumers don't consume.
Det blir ikke noe fart da før klokka 3. Da blir det fart.
And it really complicates the matter for the Federal Reserve, and yet you still expect them to at least be able to act if conditions were kept until the end of the year.
Well, I mean, inflation has been going down. It is almost to target. At the same time, there isn't a big slowdown in economic activity, and that could lead the Fed to apply judgment that the time has come for some reduction in interest rates. But for now, they are saying, well, let's see what next, because as you said, we don't know whether there may be upward pressure from energy prices on inflation. We don't know whether the tariff situation would stabilize. There have been some positive steps.
Så typisk da. Impro.
Some agreements already in place, a commitment to continue to negotiate, but that has not yet been finalized.
The blanket tariffs, the pause ends on July 9th. We don't know which way that will go, right? We have seen this ongoing uncertainty and, of course, the geopolitics as well. A little bit of a lack of confidence when it comes to American assets, whether it's the US dollar or treasuries and volatility around that. Do you expect that to continue? I guess my question is also something that has been asked a lot, the end of US exceptionalism.
Well, let's recognize two things. One, the US economy is very dynamic. It is an innovation-driven economy. It is one of the very few where productivity has been growing, much stronger than in the rest of the world. It has very deep and liquid capital markets, and it attracts financial flows for all these reasons. When we look at the size of the US economy, say about a quarter of the world economy, and then we look at the size of financial assets in the United States, which is almost 3/4 of financial assets of the world, inevitably there would be some thinking maybe there has to be more diversification to other places. What is the problem? The rest of the world economy doesn't show the same dynamism and profitability for money to fly there.
Are you seeing more of that here in Japan?
I am impressed by what Japan has been doing over the last years. We have seen monetary policy normalization proceeding robustly, steadily. Japan's growth is very close to potential. We assess potential growth at around 0.5 percentage point. Japan, we expect to grow this year, maybe even 0.6%. But aging population and limits to that ability to offer more dynamism means that policymakers and businesses have to do more.
And it's so difficult for the Bank of Japan that's trying to normalize and hike rates, and we're seeing this divergent monetary path around the world. That brings its own risks.
It is a very different world today than what we had right after COVID. Right after COVID, we had central banks going in a lockstep. Monetary policy opened up more space for injecting liquidity in the economy. So monetary policy, fiscal policy, all over the world, pretty much doing the same thing. Now we are in a very different place when monetary policy around the world has to go in different directions. We have in some countries monetary policy some tightening. We see some countries actually losing, getting to be more.
Jeg tror ikke det skjer så jævlig mer nå, tror du, Robert?
Why is this difficult? It is much
Ja,
easier
det så rolig ut,
to
ja.
sit in your chair as a governor of a central bank, look around and say everybody is cutting, I'm cutting as well. Or
Jeg lurer på å ta kvelden, jeg. Jeg skal følge med hele tiden, men for jeg må opp og skrive morgenmail om 4 timer.
place where everybody
Jeg tror du skulle svinge mye mer, jeg. Jeg tror du skulle svinge mye mer her på åpning. Det var bare rett opp og så rett ned den.
Så når åpner Asian da?
Klokka 3.
Halv?
Klokka 3.
Det 3?
Ja.
Vær så litt. Jeg har litt inn på en andre konto, tror jeg.
Nei, men jeg bare gjør det jeg gjør, jeg. Så bare snakkes vi i morgen tidlig, eller? Hvis det er noe sånn psycho, så går jeg på etterpå. Greit.
Yes, det er godt.
Så godt da, ha det.
Hei.